In the grand theater of human interaction, where most individuals scramble for attention, validation, and recognition, there exists a rare breed of person who operates from an entirely different paradigm. This individual has discovered the profound power that lies not in competing with others, but in transcending the very need for competition itself. They have learned that true dominance is not achieved through external conquest, but through the complete mastery of one's internal landscape. The concept of silent dominance represents a psychological evolution that few achieve. It requires the deliberate destruction of one's weaker self, the self that seeks approval, fears rejection, and operates from scarcity. This transformation is not merely about becoming confident or assertive, it is about reaching a state of internal sovereignty so complete that external circumstances lose their power to disturb one's equilibrium. Marcus had always been the type of man who felt the need to prove himself. In boardrooms, he would speak louder than necessary. At social gatherings, he would interrupt conversations to share his achievements. His entire identity was built upon the reactions of others, their approval serving as the fuel that powered his sense of self-worth. He was a successful attorney, respected by his peers, yet internally he lived in constant anxiety about maintaining his reputation. The transformation began on a Tuesday morning that seemed no different from any other. Marcus was preparing for what he considered the most important case of his career, a high-profile corporate litigation that would either cement his status as one of the city's premier lawyers or potentially damage his reputation irreparably. As he stood before his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time, he caught sight of his own eyes. In them, he saw something that disturbed him deeply: desperation. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Despite all his success, all his achievements, he was still the same insecure boy who had sought his father's approval decades ago. Every victory was temporary, every achievement hollow, because they were all built upon the unstable foundation of external validation. He was a prisoner of his own need to be seen as successful, and this prison had walls that grew higher with each passing year. That morning, something fundamental shifted in Marcus's consciousness. He began to understand that his entire approach to life was fundamentally flawed. He was engaging in a game where the rules were determined by others, where victory was defined by external metrics, and where he would never truly win because the goalposts would always move. The psychology of silent dominance was born from this moment of clarity, the understanding that the only competition that mattered was the one with his former self. The journey toward silent dominance begins with the recognition that most human behavior is driven by fear of rejection, fear of inadequacy, fear of being forgotten or overlooked. This fear manifests in countless ways: the need to be the smartest person in the room, the compulsion to share every achievement on social media, the inability to remain silent when others are speaking, the constant comparison with others' successes. These behaviors, while seemingly confident, actually reveal deep insecurity and dependence on external validation. Marcus began to observe his own behavior with the detachment of a scientist studying a specimen. He noticed how he would subtly steer conversations toward his recent victories in court. He observed his compulsion to check his phone for social media notifications, each like or comment providing a small hit of validation. He became aware of how he would unconsciously position himself as superior to others in subtle ways, name-dropping, humble bragging, or dismissing others' achievements to preserve his own sense of importance. This self-observation was not an exercise in self-flagellation, but rather a necessary step in understanding the mechanics of his psychological imprisonment. He realized that his need to compete with others was actually a symptom of his inability to compete with himself, to push beyond his own limitations and become the person he was capable of being. True dominance, he began to understand, was not about conquering others but about conquering the weak aspects of his own nature. The weak self is characterized by its reactivity to external circumstances. It feels elated when praised and devastated when criticized. It measures its worth by comparison to others and lives in constant fear of losing its position in the social hierarchy. The weak self is addicted to drama, to the ups and downs of emotional turbulence, because these fluctuations provide a sense of aliveness that it mistakes for authentic living. Marcus recognized that his weak self had been running his life like an incompetent CEO. Every decision was made from a place of insecurity, every action motivated by the need to maintain an image rather than to create genuine value. His relationships were superficial because he was too busy performing to be authentic. His work, while technically excellent, lacked the innovative spark that comes from true confidence and inner security. The process of destroying this weak self began with what psychologists call de-identification, the practice of observing one's thoughts and emotions without being consumed by them. Marcus started a daily practice of sitting quietly for 20 minutes each morning, simply watching the parade of thoughts and feelings that arose in his consciousness. He began to see that he was not his thoughts, not his emotions, and certainly not the roles he played in the external world. This practice revealed something profound. Beneath the layer of anxiety, need, and reactivity existed a calm, centered presence that required nothing from the outside world to feel complete. This presence was not dependent on winning cases, impressing colleagues, or maintaining any particular image. It simply existed, whole and self-contained, like a mountain that remains unmoved by the storms that rage around its peaks. As Marcus connected more deeply with this inner presence, his external behavior began to change in ways that surprised even him. In meetings, he found himself speaking less but with more impact. When he did contribute to conversations, his words carried a weight that commanded natural attention and respect. He stopped feeling the need to prove his intelligence or worth because these qualities became self-evident in his presence. The transformation was not immediately apparent to others, but its effects were unmistakable. Colleagues began seeking his counsel more frequently, not because he was more knowledgeable than before, but because his responses came from a place of clarity and detachment that provided valuable perspective. Clients felt more confident in his abilities because his confidence was no longer brittle and defensive but solid and unshakable. The psychology of silent dominance operates on several key principles that Marcus had unconsciously begun to embody. The first principle is non-reactivity. While others around him would become agitated by setbacks, frustrated by delays, or elated by victories, Marcus maintained an even keel. This emotional stability was not the result of suppression or denial, but rather came from his deep understanding that external circumstances were temporary and had no bearing on his essential worth. This non-reactivity had a profound effect on those around him. In a world where most people are constantly triggered by events, opinions, and circumstances, a person who remains calm and centered stands out like a lighthouse in a storm. Others began to gravitate toward his stability, finding in his presence a refuge from the chaos of their own emotional turbulence. The second principle is outcome independence. Marcus had previously been attached to the results of his efforts to an unhealthy degree. A lost case would send him into days of self-doubt and recrimination. A victory would provide temporary elation followed by anxiety about maintaining his winning streak. As he developed silent dominance, he learned to engage fully in his work while remaining detached from the outcomes. This paradoxical approach, caring deeply about the quality of his work while remaining indifferent to external results, actually made him more effective. Without the weight of attachment clouding his judgment, he could make clearer decisions, take calculated risks, and approach each case with fresh perspective rather than the baggage of previous victories or defeats. The third principle is authentic presence. The weak self is constantly performing, always on, exhaustingly trying to manage others' perceptions. The silently dominant individual has no image to maintain because their sense of self is not dependent on others' opinions. This freedom from performance allows for genuine connection and authentic communication. Marcus discovered that when he stopped trying to impress people, he actually became more impressive. When he ceased attempting to prove his worth, his natural value became apparent. When he released his grip on others' approval, he found that respect came to him naturally and effortlessly. The fourth principle is strategic silence. In a culture that rewards the loudest voice and the most frequent contributor, the power of strategic silence is vastly underestimated. Marcus learned that by speaking less, his words carried more weight. By listening more, he gained insights that gave him significant advantages in negotiations and courtroom proceedings. Silence, he discovered, was not passive but actively powerful. It created space for others to reveal themselves, often to their own detriment. It allowed him to observe dynamics and patterns that he had previously missed while focused on formulating his next response. Most importantly, it communicated a level of confidence and self-possession that no amount of clever rhetoric could match. The transformation in Marcus's professional life was remarkable, but the changes in his personal relationships were even more profound. His marriage, which had been strained by his constant need for validation and his inability to be fully present, began to flourish. His wife found herself drawn to this new version of her husband, a man who was confident without being arrogant, present without being clingy, and strong without being domineering. His relationships with his children also transformed. Previously, he had unconsciously competed with them for attention, feeling threatened when they achieved something notable. Now, secure in his own sense of self, he could celebrate their successes without feeling diminished. They, in turn, began to see him not as a source of pressure and expectation, but as a pillar of strength and stability. The psychology of silent dominance extends beyond personal transformation to encompass a fundamental understanding of power dynamics in human interactions. Traditional dominance is often loud, aggressive, and insecure. It relies on intimidation, manipulation, and the subjugation of others to maintain its position. This type of dominance is ultimately fragile because it depends on external circumstances and the compliance of others. Silent dominance, by contrast, is self-contained and unshakable. It does not need to diminish others to feel powerful because its source of power is internal and infinite. This type of dominance actually empowers others because it operates from abundance rather than scarcity. The silently dominant individual can afford to be generous with praise, credit, and opportunities because they are not threatened by others' success. Marcus began to notice how differently people responded to this new version of himself. Opposing counsel, who had previously tried to intimidate or manipulate him, found their tactics ineffective against his calm assurance. Judges respected his measured approach and thoughtful arguments. Even adversaries began to treat him with a level of respect that had nothing to do with his legal skills and everything to do with his presence and character. The process of destroying the weak self is not a one-time event but an ongoing practice that requires vigilance and commitment. The weak self does not surrender easily, it will continually attempt to reassert itself through old patterns of thought and behavior. Marcus found that certain situations, high-stress cases, social events where his status might be questioned, interactions with particularly challenging personalities would sometimes trigger his old insecurities. However, having developed the capacity for self-observation and emotional regulation, he was able to catch these patterns early and redirect his response. Rather than being unconsciously driven by fear and ego, he could consciously choose how to engage with each situation. This conscious choice, repeated thousands of times in small moments, gradually rewired his psychological patterns and strengthened his capacity for silent dominance. The weak self thrives on comparison, always measuring itself against others and finding either superiority or inferiority in the contrast. The silently dominant individual has transcended the need for comparison because they understand that each person's journey is unique and that their own worth is not relative but absolute. This shift from comparative to absolute thinking eliminates the anxiety that comes from constantly jockeying for position in imaginary hierarchies. Marcus realized that much of his previous stress had come from his unconscious participation in endless competitions that existed primarily in his own mind. He had been competing with colleagues for recognition, with other parents for the achievement of having the most successful children, with other men for status symbols and social position. These competitions were exhausting because they never ended and the rules constantly changed. By withdrawing from these imaginary competitions, Marcus found himself with enormous reserves of energy that he had previously squandered on pointless contests. This energy could now be directed toward meaningful pursuits, becoming better at his craft, deepening his relationships, contributing to his community, and continuing his own psychological and spiritual development. The silence in silent dominance is not merely the absence of speech but the presence of deep listening and heightened awareness. Marcus developed the ability to read situations and people with remarkable accuracy because he was no longer distracted by his own need to perform or defend his ego. He could perceive the underlying currents in conversations, the unspoken motivations behind people's actions, and the emotional subtext that others missed. This enhanced perception gave him significant advantages in his legal practice. He could anticipate opponents' strategies, understand jurors' concerns, and communicate with witnesses in ways that put them at ease and encouraged honesty. His closing arguments became legendary not for their rhetoric but for their ability to speak directly to the hearts and minds of those who heard them. The man who destroys his weak self becomes invulnerable to the attacks and manipulations that devastate those who remain psychologically fragmented. When someone attempted to insult Marcus or undermine his confidence, the attacks found no purchase because they were aimed at an identity he no longer carried. Criticism, when valid, was received as useful information rather than a threat to his self-worth. When invalid, it was simply ignored without emotional reaction. This invulnerability was not the result of hardness or callousness but came from a deep understanding of his own nature and worth. Like a master martial artist who can remain relaxed in the face of an attack because they are confident in their ability to respond appropriately, Marcus could remain calm in the face of psychological aggression because he was secure in his psychological foundation. The ripple effects of this transformation extended far beyond Marcus's immediate circle. His law firm began attracting higher quality clients and cases because the energy he brought to his work was magnetic and inspiring. Young lawyers sought him out as a mentor because they sensed something different about his approach, a depth and authenticity that was rare in their profession. His family life became a source of genuine fulfillment rather than another area where he felt pressured to perform. His children grew up with a model of masculinity that was strong without being toxic, confident without being arrogant, and successful without being ruthless. His marriage deepened into a partnership based on mutual respect and authentic intimacy rather than performed roles and hidden resentments. The psychology of silent dominance reveals that true power comes not from controlling others but from mastering oneself. It demonstrates that genuine confidence requires no external validation because it springs from an unshakable inner foundation. It shows that the highest form of strength is not the ability to impose one's will on others but the capacity to remain centered and purposeful regardless of external circumstances. Marcus had discovered what ancient wisdom traditions have taught for millennia, that the greatest victory is the one achieved over oneself. In destroying his weak, needy, reactive self, he had become truly indestructible. No external force could shake him because his strength came from within. No criticism could diminish him because his worth was not dependent on others' opinions. No setback could defeat him because his identity was not tied to temporary circumstances. This transformation was not the end of Marcus's journey but, rather the beginning of a new phase of existence characterized by authentic power, genuine peace, and meaningful contribution. He had learned to live from his essence rather than his ego, to respond rather than react, to create value rather than seek validation. The path to silent dominance is not easy, and it is not for everyone. It requires the courage to face one's own weaknesses and limitations without flinching. It demands the discipline to consistently choose growth over comfort, truth over flattery, and authenticity over performance. It asks for the patience to trust the process even when external results are slow to appear. Yet for those who undertake this journey, the rewards are immeasurable. They discover a source of strength and peace that cannot be taken away, a confidence that needs no external support, and a power that grows stronger with time rather than diminishing. They learn that by conquering themselves, they become unconquerable by others. The weak self fears destruction because it mistakes itself for the totality of who we are. The silently dominant individual understands that this weak self is merely a collection of conditioning, habits, and limiting beliefs that can be observed, understood, and ultimately transcended. In its destruction lies not death but rebirth, the emergence of one's authentic nature, unencumbered by the psychological baggage that weighs down most of humanity. Marcus's story is not unique except in its conscious undertaking. The potential for this transformation exists within every individual who has grown tired of living as a prisoner of their own insecurities and reactive patterns. The psychology of silent dominance offers a roadmap for this transformation, a way of being that honors both individual strength and collective harmony. In a world increasingly characterized by noise, aggression, and desperate attempts to capture attention, the silently dominant individual stands as a beacon of possibility. They demonstrate that there is another way to move through life, with grace, purpose, and unshakable inner strength. They show that true dominance has nothing to do with dominating others and everything to do with mastering oneself. The man who destroys his weak self discovers that he has not lost anything of value but has rather removed the barriers to expressing his true nature. Like a sculptor who removes excess marble to reveal the statue within, the destruction of the weak self reveals the powerful, authentic, and infinitely valuable individual who was always there, waiting to be uncovered. This is the ultimate paradox of silent dominance. By seeking to dominate nothing external, one gains dominion over everything that truly matters. By competing with no one, one becomes unconquerable. By explaining nothing, one's actions speak with profound clarity. By pursuing no external validation, one becomes genuinely impressive. By destroying one's weak self, one becomes truly indestructible. The journey continues, not as a destination to be reached but as a way of being to be embodied. Each day offers new opportunities to choose strength over weakness, presence over performance, and authenticity over pretense. Each interaction becomes a chance to practice silent dominance, to remain centered while others lose their composure, to speak truth while others traffic in manipulation, to create value while others seek only to take. This is not a path of isolation or superiority but of service and connection. The silently dominant individual becomes a source of stability and inspiration for others, not through preaching or performance but through the simple power of authentic being. They prove that it is possible to be strong without being cruel, confident without being arrogant, and successful without sacrificing integrity. In mastering themselves, they give others permission to do the same. In transcending the need for competition, they create space for collaboration. In explaining nothing, they invite others to look deeper and think more carefully. In pursuing no external dominance, they exercise the only dominance that truly matters: mastery over their own thoughts, emotions, and actions. The psychology of silent dominance is ultimately an invitation to become who you truly are beneath the layers of conditioning, fear, and reactive patterns that have accumulated over a lifetime. It is a call to destroy not your essential nature but the false self that has been masquerading as the real you. It is an opportunity to discover the unshakable foundation upon which genuine confidence, authentic power, and lasting peace can be built. For those ready to undertake this journey, the path is clear. Begin by observing yourself without judgment, question your motivations without mercy, and choose growth over comfort in each moment of decision. The weak self will resist, but its resistance grows weaker with each conscious choice to act from strength rather than fear. The destination is not a place but a way of being, is silent in its power, dominant through mastery rather than force, indestructible because it is built upon the only foundation that cannot be shaken, the truth of who you really are when all pretense is stripped away. This is the ultimate victory, the final competition, and the only explanation that matters.